Imagine your home is on fire. Flames are swallowing everything you own. In that moment of pure terror, a fire brigade arrives, but they don't move. They just stand there, watching. Their leader steps forward, not with a water hose, but with a contract. He offers to buy your burning home, right there on the spot, for a tiny fraction of what it's worth. If you agree, his men will put out the fire. If you refuse, they'll watch it all turn to ash. This isn't a scene from some dystopian movie. This was the business model of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the man who became one of the richest people in Roman history by turning tragedy into his personal gold mine. In the crowded, chaotic heart of the Roman Republic, one man's name was synonymous with a level of wealth that was almost mythical: Marcus Licinius Crassus. His fortune was so vast that some historians estimate it may have rivaled the entire annual treasury of the Roman state. In today's terms, while it's impossible to be precise, we'd be talking about a net worth in the tens, maybe even hundreds of billions of dollars. But Crassus wasn't born with a silver spoon. His family's fortunes were wiped out during a bloody civil war. He clawed his way back, not just to wealth, but to a level of riches that could fund entire armies. And he did it with ruthless ambition, sharp political maneuvering, and one of the most predatory business schemes in history. This is the story of how one man built an empire on the misfortunes of others, pioneering a brutal form of disaster capitalism more than 2,000 years ago. He didn't just get rich, he exploited the flames that brought Rome to its knees. To understand how Crassus got so obscenely rich, you first have to understand the city he lived in. Rome in the 1st century BC was the biggest, most crowded city in the world. But it was also a death trap. Most people were crammed into towering, shoddily built apartment blocks called insulae. Think of them as multi-story tinderboxes made with cheap timber and packed so tightly together that the streets below were in constant shadow. Fires weren't just a possibility, they were an almost daily reality. A single spark from a cooking fire, a knocked-over oil lamp, and an entire city block could be gone in minutes. So, what was the official response to this constant threat? There wasn't one. The late Roman Republic had no public fire department. No organized city service was coming to the rescue. There were only the Tresviri Nocturni, night watchmen who were more of a police force, and their efforts were usually just forming a bucket brigade, a completely hopeless gesture against a raging inferno. If your home caught fire, you were on your own. You could pray, you could scream for your neighbors, but there was no professional help on the way. Your home, your savings, your entire life could be erased overnight. This constant, terrifying vulnerability created a desperate need that the state simply ignored. And it was in that gap that Marcus Crassus saw an opportunity of breathtaking scale. Crassus was a master at seeing profit where everyone else saw chaos. He got his start by cashing in on another Roman disaster, the proscriptions of the dictator Sulla. Sulla published lists of his political enemies, basically marking them for death and seizing their property. Those confiscated estates were then auctioned off for pennies on the dollar. Crassus became one of the biggest buyers, gobbling up land and property from the families of the condemned. Some even whispered that he had names added to the lists just to get his hands on their fortunes. This was his first taste of profiting from ruin, and it laid the foundation for his empire. But his real predatory genius came with the creation of his private fire brigade. He put together a force of 500 men, slaves trained as architects, builders, and most importantly, firefighters. Whenever the cry of fire echoed through Rome's narrow streets, Crassus's brigade was there in a flash. They were fast, they were organized, and they were well equipped. But they didn't come to save the day. They came to make a deal. As a property owner watched in horror, Crassus or one of his agents would calmly walk up and make an offer. He'd offer to buy the burning building, and often the neighboring buildings threatened by the flames, for an insulting pittance of their real value. The owner faced an impossible choice: sell your property to this vulture and salvage something from the disaster, or refuse and be left with absolutely nothing but rubble and ash. The negotiation happened under the worst pressure imaginable, with the sound of cracking timbers as the ticking clock. And the longer the owner hesitated, the more the fire spread, and the lower Crassus's offer would go. Of course, most people sold. Only after the deed was signed and the property was legally his did Crassus order his men to spring into action and put out the fire. He had turned firefighting into an acquisition strategy. This scheme was morbidly brilliant. Crassus wasn't just buying up single properties. He was systematically acquiring huge chunks of Rome for next to nothing. The ancient historian Plutarch wrote that through this method, the largest part of Rome came into his possession. He had the whole process vertically integrated. After buying a fire-damaged property, he didn't need to hire contractors. He already owned a massive workforce of skilled slaves, architects and builders who would immediately clear the rubble and rebuild. They put up stronger, better buildings, which he then rented out or sold for an astronomical profit. He controlled everything, from disaster to acquisition to reconstruction. This on top of his other businesses, silver mines in Spain, a huge slave trading operation, and lending money to indebted senators, made his fortune swell to its legendary size. He was so wealthy that he famously declared that no man could be considered rich unless he could pay for an entire military legion out of his own pocket, a boast he could easily back up. This wealth bought him more than just villas. It bought him power. He became a primary financial backer for a young, ambitious politician named Julius Caesar, basically becoming his patron. His money was the glue that held together the first triumvirate, the unofficial political alliance between himself, Caesar, and the great general Pompey. These three men controlled the fate of the Roman Republic, and Crassus, the man who got rich off fires and ruin, sat among them as an equal. The story of Crassus is a chilling reminder that the line between innovation and exploitation can be terrifyingly thin. It makes you wonder, how do these same patterns of profiting from disaster play out today? Can you see any parallels to Crassus's methods in the modern world? Let me know what you think down in the comments. And if you find these dives into the darker side of history as fascinating as I do, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next one. For all his money and power, Crassus desperately craved something his wealth couldn't buy: military glory. He was jealous of the battlefield victories of his partners, Pompey and Caesar. He had crushed the slave revolt led by Spartacus, a brutal campaign that ended with 6,000 captured slaves being crucified along the Appian Way, but Pompey managed to steal most of the credit. This hunger for a warrior's legacy would be his undoing. In 55 BC, Crassus became governor of Syria. He saw it as a launching pad for a glorious war against the powerful Parthian Empire to the east. His advisors told him it was a terrible idea. The Parthians were a formidable enemy, but Crassus, blinded by greed and ambition, ignored them. He even looted the sacred temple of Jerusalem on his way to war, doubling down on his reputation for avarice. The campaign was a complete catastrophe. At the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, the Parthian horse archers decimated his legions in the desert. His own son was killed in the battle. Finally, Crassus was tricked into a peace talk that was actually an ambush. A scuffle broke out, and Crassus was killed. It was a humiliating end for a man whose life was defined by ruthless success. What happened next became the stuff of legend, a final poetic insult to the richest man in Rome. While the exact details are debated, the most famous story, told by the historian Cassius Dio, claims the Parthians mocked his insatiable greed by pouring molten gold down his throat. It's likely just a story, but it's a fitting end for a man who had metaphorically swallowed so much of Rome's wealth. Another account says his severed head was used as a prop in a play for the Parthian king. The death of Crassus had catastrophic consequences back in Rome. His money and influence had been the critical buffer between Caesar and Pompey. With him gone, the fragile triumvirate shattered. Within 4 years, Rome plunged back into a devastating civil war, the war that would finally kill the Republic and give rise to the Roman Empire. The legacy of Marcus Crassus is a complicated one. He was a financial pioneer, a political kingmaker, and a man whose methods feel disturbingly modern. He saw a city's greatest weakness and turned it into his personal strength, building an empire not of conquered lands, but of real estate taken through extortion. He proved that in a world of chaos, the person who controls the response to a disaster can end up controlling everything else. Crassus may not have started the fires, but he let them burn, and in their flames he saw the reflection of pure gold.